My daughter and her husband took me hiking to a scenic cliff. When I was distracted admiring the view, he pushed me over the edge. Despite the agony, I stayed completely still. Their plan was to fake an accident and steal my $3 million inheritance. But I survived and turned their lives into a living nightmare. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I should have seen it coming when Sarah suggested the family hiking trip. My 35-year-old daughter never suggested anything that didn't benefit her directly. But there I was, 6 months after burying my husband Robert, desperately craving any connection with my only child and her husband Michael. "Mom, you've been cooped up in that house too long," Sarah had said during her rare phone call 3 weeks earlier. "Michael found this gorgeous trail in Colorado. The autumn colors are supposed to be spectacular this time of year. It'll be good for you to get some fresh air." Fresh air. As if grief could be cured by elevation and exercise. But I agreed because I missed her, missed the family dinners, missed feeling like I mattered to someone. Robert's death had left me wealthy but utterly alone, and Sarah knew exactly which buttons to push. The drive to Cliffside Trail took 2 hours from Denver. Michael chatted enthusiastically about his new promotion at the investment firm, while Sarah scrolled through her phone in the passenger seat. I sat in the back like a child, watching the landscape change from suburban sprawl to rolling hills dotted with golden aspens. "This is perfect weather for hiking," Michael said, adjusting his designer sunglasses. "Not too hot, not too cold, and the visibility today is incredible." The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty on this Tuesday morning. Most sensible people were at work, not dragging their recently widowed mothers up mountain paths. But Michael had insisted Tuesday was better. Fewer crowds, better photo opportunities. "Let's get some pictures before we start," Sarah said, suddenly animated. She pulled out her phone and began taking shots of the 3 of us by the trail marker. "Mom, move a little to the left. Perfect. This is going to be such a nice memory." Memory. The word should have triggered alarm bells, but I was too grateful for her attention to question anything. The trail began gently, winding through stands of aspen and pine. Michael carried a large backpack filled with water bottles, granola bars, and what he called emergency supplies. Sarah walked between us, occasionally linking her arm through mine in a gesture that felt more performed than genuine. "Remember when we used to hike when you were little?" I asked her as we navigated a particularly rocky section. "Not really," she replied, her voice distracted. "Michael, how much further to the viewpoint?" "About another mile," he said, checking his GPS watch. "Trust me, it's worth it. The cliff overlooks the entire valley." Cliff, another word that should have raised red flags. But I was 65 years old, reasonably fit, and confident in my ability to handle a moderate hiking trail. What I wasn't prepared for was my own family's capacity for betrayal. The viewpoint was everything Michael had promised. A dramatic granite outcropping that jutted out over a 200-foot drop into a rocky ravine below. The autumn foliage spread out like a patchwork quilt, breathtaking in its beauty. "Isn't this incredible, Mom?" Sarah said, suddenly solicitous. "Come closer to the edge. You can see the whole valley from here." I should have noticed how they positioned themselves behind me. Should have questioned why Michael was adjusting his backpack straps so carefully, why Sarah was checking her phone again, why they both seemed nervous despite the successful hike. Instead, I stepped closer to the edge, mesmerized by the view. The wind caught my hair, and for a moment, I felt something approaching peace for the first time since Robert's funeral. That's when I felt Michael's hands on my back. The push was quick, calculated, and brutal. One moment I was admiring the golden valley below. The next I was tumbling through empty air, branches tearing at my clothes, rocks scraping against my skin. My nursing training kicked in even as I fell. Protect your head. Try to control the landing. Don't fight the momentum. But physics doesn't care about training, and gravity doesn't negotiate. I hit a ledge about 30 feet down, my left shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. Pain exploded through my body like lightning, but the ledge was narrow, barely 3 feet wide. One wrong move, and I'd continue falling to the bottom of the ravine. Above me, I could hear voices. Sarah's panicked-sounding cry of, "Mom! Oh my God, Mom!" Michael's urgent shouts about calling for help. To anyone listening, they sounded like distraught family members dealing with a tragic accident, but I could see them from my position on the ledge. Sarah was looking down, not with horror, but with calculation. Michael had pulled out his phone, but he wasn't dialing 911. He was texting someone. My medical background had taught me to stay still when injured, to assess damage before moving. That caution probably saved my life, because it kept me quiet long enough to hear their real conversation. "Can you see her?" Michael asked, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "She's on that ledge," Sarah replied, her tone completely different from the panicked daughter act she'd performed moments earlier. "Is she moving?" "Doesn't look like it." "Should I throw some rocks?" "No, you idiot. It has to look like an accident. Besides, it's a 30-foot fall onto granite. She's probably already dead." Already dead. My own daughter was standing 30 feet above me, calmly discussing whether I was dead yet, and sounding almost disappointed that I might have survived their murder attempt. "What if she's just unconscious?" Sarah asked. "What if someone finds her and she wakes up?" "Then we stick to the story," Michael said. "She was admiring the view, got too close to the edge, slipped and fell. We're devastated. We tried to save her. These things happen with elderly people." Elderly people. I was 65, not 90, but to them, I was just an old woman whose time had conveniently come. "How long do we wait?" Sarah asked. "Give it another 10 minutes, then we hike back down and call emergency services. By the time they get here and retrieve the body, we'll be the grieving family." I forced myself to remain perfectly still, even though my shoulder felt like it was on fire and I could taste blood in my mouth. Every instinct screamed at me to call out, to let them know I was alive, to beg for help. But something deeper, some survival instinct born from 65 years of being underestimated, kept me silent. "The lawyer said the will reading is next week," Michael continued. $3 million in investments, plus the house. We can pay off the credit cards, the mortgage, maybe even buy that place in Aspen you wanted. "What about the life insurance?" Sarah asked. "Another $2 million. This little hiking trip is going to solve all our financial problems. $5 million. That's what my life was worth to them. $5 million and the freedom to live without the inconvenience of an aging mother who expected to be included in their lives. We should probably act more upset when we call it in," Sarah said. "Really sell the tragedy. Don't worry, baby, I've got this. I'll handle the authorities, you handle the tears." They spent another 8 minutes discussing the logistics of their performance. Who would call 911, what they would say, how they would explain the delay in reporting my accident. They had clearly thought this through, planned it carefully, chosen this remote location specifically because it would be hours before help arrived. Finally, I heard their footsteps moving away from the edge as they began their hike back to the parking lot. Sarah called out one last time, "Mom, can you hear me? We're going to get help." The concern in her voice was Oscar-worthy. But I was done being their victim. The fall had been meant to kill me, but instead it had revealed the truth about who my daughter really was. And now I had something they didn't know I possessed, knowledge of their plan, and the burning desire to destroy them with it. The pain in my shoulder was excruciating, but I was alive, I was conscious, and I was angrier than I'd ever been in my entire life. Sarah and Michael had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They thought they were heading back to collect their inheritance, but they were actually walking into a trap they didn't even know existed yet. It took me 47 minutes to climb off that ledge. Every movement sent waves of pain through my dislocated shoulder, but fury is a powerful anesthetic. My daughter and her husband were probably calling 911 right about now, reporting their tragic accident with practiced grief in their voices. The climb down from the ledge was treacherous, but my nurse's training included basic first aid and emergency procedures. I knew how to splint an arm, how to move with a dislocated shoulder, how to find handholds on rock faces, skills I'd learned in wilderness medicine courses that Robert had encouraged me to take years ago. "You never know when you'll need to save someone's life," he used to say. He just never imagined I'd be saving my own from our daughter. By the time I reached the bottom of the ravine, I could hear sirens in the distance. The emergency vehicles were arriving right on schedule, just as Sarah and Michael had planned. I followed a creek bed that ran parallel to the main trail, staying hidden in the tree line until I reached the road about half a mile from the parking area. A tourist couple from Texas stopped when they saw me stumbling along the roadside, my clothes torn and blood on my face. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" the woman asked, jumping out of their SUV. "Do you need medical attention?" "I took a fall on one of the trails," I said, which was technically true. "Could you drive me to the nearest urgent care clinic? I think my shoulder is dislocated." They were kind people, the sort who would help a stranger without asking too many questions. I made up a story about hiking alone, taking a wrong turn, slipping on loose rocks. They tisked sympathetically and drove me to a clinic in the next town over, insisting on waiting while I got checked out. The doctor confirmed my shoulder was dislocated, along with several nasty scrapes and what would become spectacular bruises. "You're lucky," he said while resetting the joint. "Falls like that can be fatal at your age." At my age, everyone kept reminding me how old I was, how fragile, how lucky to be alive. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt dangerous. I paid cash for the treatment, giving a false name and address. No insurance cards, no paper trail. As far as the medical system was concerned, a woman named Helen Roberts had been treated for hiking injuries. Margaret Thompson was still lying dead at the bottom of a cliff, or so her family believed. The Texas couple offered to drive me home, but I declined, claiming my son was coming to pick me up. Instead, I took a taxi to a motel on the outskirts of town, paid for 3 nights in advance, and settled in to plan my revenge. The news report that evening was exactly what I expected. Local woman dies in hiking accident. There was a brief interview with Sarah and Michael, both looking appropriately devastated. Sarah had managed to produce real tears, which was more acting ability than I'd given her credit for. She loved the outdoors, Sarah told the reporter, her voice breaking. She just wanted to see the autumn colors one more time. If only we'd stayed closer to her, if only we'd been more careful. Michael wrapped his arm around his wife protectively. "Margaret was like a second mother to me," he said. "We're going to miss her terribly. She lived such a full life, and she died doing something she loved. Such a full life, past tense. In their minds, I was already buried and forgotten, nothing more than a bank account waiting to be emptied. I spent the next 2 days watching them from a distance. They went through the motions of grief beautifully, meeting with funeral directors, accepting condolences from neighbors, playing the part of a devastated family. But when they thought no one was looking, I caught glimpses of their real selves. Michael researching luxury cars on his phone while sitting in the funeral parlor. Sarah browsing vacation rental websites during what was supposed to be a somber dinner with Robert's old friends. They weren't mourning my death. They were celebrating their windfall. The will reading was scheduled for the following Monday. I learned this by calling my attorney's office, disguising my voice as Sarah's assistant. The entire estate, house, investments, life insurance, would officially transfer to my grieving daughter within the week. But here's the thing about being dead. It gives you remarkable freedom to act without consequences. Dead people don't have reputations to protect, relationships to maintain, or social conventions to follow. Dead people can be absolutely ruthless, and I had 6 days to become the most ruthlessly effective dead person who ever walked the earth. Being dead is surprisingly liberating. I spent the 3rd day after my murder doing something I'd never done in 65 years of law-abiding life. I broke into my own house. Sarah and Michael were at the funeral home making arrangements for my memorial service. Nothing too expensive, of course, since they were still pretending to be financially struggling. I knew their schedule because I'd been following them, and grief-stricken relatives are remarkably predictable in their routines. The spare key was still hidden under the fake rock by the back patio, exactly where Robert had placed it 5 years ago. In case of emergencies, he'd said. This definitely qualified. Walking through my own home as a dead person was surreal. Everything looked the same, but I could see it now through Sarah and Michael's eyes, not as my sanctuary, but as their jackpot. The Waterford Crystal Collection Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary, the antique furniture my grandmother had left me, the paintings we'd collected during our European trips. All of it was about to become theirs, along with the insurance money that would let them live like royalty for the rest of their lives. I headed straight for Robert's study, where he'd kept all our important documents. Sarah and Michael had already been through here. I could tell by the slightly disturbed papers and the way the filing cabinet drawer wasn't quite closed properly. They'd probably been looking for investment statements and insurance policies, calculating their windfall, but they'd missed what I was looking for. Robert's old recording equipment. My husband had been a meticulous man who believed in documenting everything. He'd recorded every business meeting, every important phone call, every conversation that might someday matter. Trust, but verify, he used to say, and always keep records. The digital recorder was exactly where I remembered it, tucked away in his desk drawer along with the tiny wireless microphones he'd used for board meetings. Technology he'd insisted on learning, even though it frustrated him. "Margaret, we're living in the digital age," he'd said. "We need to adapt or get left behind." Now his paranoid attention to documentation was going to save my life. I spent 2 hours setting up a surveillance system that would have made the FBI proud. Tiny microphones in their bedroom, living room, and kitchen. The main recording device hidden in the basement, behind the water heater where they'd never think to look. Everything voice-activated. Everything saved to a cloud server that Sarah didn't even know existed. While I worked, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been just 3 days ago. Trusting, naive, desperate for my daughter's love. That woman had died on the cliff just as surely as if she'd hit the rocks below. The woman rigging surveillance equipment in her own house was someone entirely new. I also planted something else. A folder filled with fake financial documents suggesting that Robert had been hiding debts, that the inheritance wasn't as substantial as Sarah believed. Let them sweat a little while they waited for the will reading. Before leaving, I took one last look at the family photos lining the hallway. Sarah as a baby, her first day of school, her wedding to Michael. In every picture, she was smiling, happy, surrounded by parents who adored her. When had that sweet child turned into a woman who could push her mother off a cliff for money? The answer didn't matter anymore. The daughter I'd raised was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw murder as a financial planning strategy. And that stranger was about to learn that dead mothers can be far more dangerous than living ones. My phone buzzed with a text message. I'd kept my old phone, knowing Sarah would expect it to be found with my body eventually. The message was from my neighbor, Mrs. Chen. "Sarah told me about your accident. I'm so sorry for her loss. You were such a wonderful woman." Were, past tense. Even my neighbors believed I was dead. I texted back, "Thank you for your kindness." Margaret would have appreciated knowing she had such caring neighbors. It felt good to speak about my former self in the past tense. That trusting, grateful woman was gone forever. The woman who remained had work to do. The memorial service was held on Saturday at the Methodist Church, where Robert and I had been married 37 years ago. I watched from my rental car across the street, wearing a brown wig and oversized sunglasses I'd purchased at a pharmacy. The turnout was respectable, about 40 people, mostly Robert's former colleagues and neighbors who remembered me fondly. Sarah had done a decent job organizing everything, though I noticed she'd chosen the least expensive flowers and had clearly instructed the caterer to keep costs minimal. Michael gave a moving eulogy about what a wonderful mother-in-law I'd been, how much I'd meant to their family, how the hiking accident had robbed them of precious years together. His performance was flawless, right down to the slight tremor in his voice when he described finding Margaret at the bottom of the cliff, finding me, as if they hadn't pushed me over the edge themselves. Sarah wept beautifully during the entire service. Designer tissues, perfect makeup that ran just enough to look authentic. She'd always been dramatic, even as a child, but this was a masterclass in deception. After the service, I followed the small group back to my house for the reception. Sarah had hired caterers and opened the good wine, Robert's expensive collection that she'd always coveted. I parked 3 houses down and activated the recording system from my phone. Through the wireless microphones I'd planted, I could hear everything. "The insurance adjuster is coming Monday," Michael told Sarah as they stood in the kitchen, their voices low. "He said it's routine for accidental death claims this size, but he doesn't expect any problems." "What about the will reading?" Sarah asked. "Tuesday at 10. Jenkins said it's straightforward. Everything to you as the sole heir. No complications, no challenges expected." "Good. I can't keep pretending to be heartbroken much longer. Mrs. Patterson from next door keeps bringing me casseroles and asking if I need anything. It's exhausting." I gripped my phone tighter. Exhausting. Playing the grieving daughter was exhausting for her. Once the insurance money comes through, we can pay off the credit cards and start looking seriously at that house in Aspen. Michael continued. Maybe take a trip to Europe to help with the grief. They actually laughed at that. My daughter and her husband were standing in my kitchen, drinking my wine and laughing about their plans to spend my life insurance money on a grief vacation. I do feel a little bad about the hiking thing, Sarah said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Maybe we could have found another way. Like what? Wait for her to die naturally? She could have lived another 20 years. Sarah, 20 years of family dinners and birthday calls and Christmas presents. 20 years of her thinking she had a right to be part of our lives. You're right. And honestly, she was getting more demanding lately. Always wanting to know what we were doing, always expecting invitations to everything. It was becoming a problem. A problem. I had become a problem that required a permanent solution. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more guests, but I'd heard enough. I had them on record discussing the murder, the insurance fraud, their complete lack of remorse. But I needed more than just confessions. I needed evidence that would hold up in court. That's when I remembered the life insurance policy details. The $5 million policy Robert had taken out 2 years ago required a waiting period for suicide claims. But there was something else. It also had a clause about deaths under investigation. If there was any question about the circumstances of death, the insurance company would conduct their own investigation before paying out. Time to make them sweat. I drove to the nearest internet cafe and created an anonymous email account. Then I sent a message to the insurance company's fraud investigation division. You should look more carefully at the Margaret Thompson death claim. Ask her daughter why she took out a cash advance on her credit card the day before the hiking trip. Ask her husband why he Googled life insurance waiting periods 2 weeks ago. Some accidents aren't really accidents. I didn't sign it, but I included enough specific details to ensure they'd take it seriously. Insurance companies hate paying out claims, and they especially hate being defrauded. The email was sent at 11:47 p.m. Saturday night. By Monday morning, Sarah and Michael's carefully planned inheritance would be frozen pending investigation. Phase 1 of my revenge was complete. Now it was time for Phase 2, making them understand exactly what they'd lost when they decided to murder their mother. The insurance investigator arrived Tuesday morning at 8:30 a.m., 2 hours before the scheduled will reading. I watched from my new vantage point, a coffee shop across from my house that had excellent Wi-Fi and clear sightlines to the front door. Sarah answered the door in a black dress, still playing the grieving daughter role. But I could see her confusion through the window as Detective Morrison showed his badge and asked to come inside. This wasn't part of their script. Through my surveillance system, I heard every word. Mrs. Walsh, I'm Detective Morrison with the Insurance Fraud Division. We've received some information regarding your mother's death that requires follow-up investigation. Information? Sarah's voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the tension. What kind of information? The kind that suggests your mother's death might not have been the accident you reported, Morrison said. We'll need to ask you and your husband some questions. Michael appeared in the background, and I could practically feel his panic through the microphone. This is ridiculous, he said. Margaret fell off a cliff. It was a tragic accident. We were there. Yes, you were there, Morrison agreed. That's exactly what we need to discuss. The questioning went on for an hour. Morrison was thorough, asking about the timeline, the location choice, their financial situation, the timing of various credit card transactions. Sarah and Michael stuck to their story, but I could hear the cracks forming. Why did you choose that particular trail? Morrison asked. Michael found it online, Sarah replied. He thought Mom would enjoy the scenery. And you'd never been there before? No, never. But I knew that was a lie. I'd found the browser history on Michael's computer during my house break-in. He'd researched that trail extensively, looking for information about emergency response times, cell phone coverage, and accident statistics. This wasn't a spontaneous family outing. It was a carefully planned murder scene. Mrs. Walsh, can you explain this cash advance? Morrison asked, and I heard papers rustling. $5,000 withdrawn from your credit card the day before the hiking trip? Silence. Sarah was probably trying to come up with a plausible explanation for money she'd taken out to pay their overdue bills before collecting the inheritance. That was for my mother's birthday present, she finally said. We were planning to surprise her next month. A $5,000 birthday present? That's quite generous for someone you described as financially independent. More silence. Michael stepped in. Detective, we're grieving here. These questions are inappropriate and insensitive. Our lawyer advised us not to discuss financial matters without representation. That's certainly your right, Morrison said. But I should let you know that the insurance payout is frozen pending completion of our investigation. All assets related to the claim will remain under review until we're satisfied about the circumstances of Mrs. Thompson's death. The silence that followed was deafening. $5 million. Suddenly out of reach. How long does an investigation like this typically take? Sarah asked, her voice small. Depends on what we find, Morrison replied. Could be weeks, could be months. We'll be in touch. After he left, I listened to Sarah and Michael's meltdown with deep satisfaction. Someone knows, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Someone saw something, or heard something, or... It's probably just routine, Michael said, but he didn't sound convinced. Insurance companies investigate all large claims. $5,000, Michael. Why did you let me take out that cash advance? It looks suspicious. Because we needed the money. The mortgage payment was due, and we couldn't wait for her to die naturally. There it was, another admission on record. What if they find something? What if someone saw us on the trail? What if there are security cameras somewhere we missed? Then we stick to the story, Michael said. We're innocent. We loved Margaret. Her death was a tragic accident that devastated our family. But their panic was showing. The perfect plan was unraveling, and they had no idea that their biggest problem wasn't the insurance investigation. Their biggest problem was that I was still alive, still listening, and just getting started. I finished my coffee and checked my watch. The will reading had been postponed due to the insurance hold, but Sarah and Michael didn't know that yet. They were probably getting dressed right now, preparing to inherit an estate that would never be theirs. Time for them to learn that dead mothers make the most dangerous enemies of all. That evening, I made my first direct move. I called Sarah's cell phone from a number she wouldn't recognize, using a voice distortion app I'd downloaded. Enjoying your inheritance, Sarah? I asked when she answered. Who is this? Someone who knows what you did to your mother. The line went dead immediately, but I could hear her panicked voice through the surveillance system. Michael, someone knows. Someone just called me about Mom. Phase 2 was complete. Now they knew they were being watched. Time for Phase 3, making them pay. The anonymous phone calls became my specialty over the next week. I'd call Sarah at random times, always from different numbers, always with just enough information to terrify her without revealing how much I actually knew. Did you enjoy spending my jewelry money? I'd ask, referencing the diamond earrings she'd sold 3 months ago. Earrings she'd claimed were lost. The police are getting closer, Sarah. They know about the trail research. Michael's gambling debts are interesting. Does he know you're planning to divorce him once you get the insurance money? That last call hit a nerve. Through my surveillance system, I heard their first real fight since my death. You told someone about the divorce papers? Michael screamed. I didn't tell anyone, Sarah shot back. Those papers are locked in our safety deposit box. But I knew about the divorce papers because I'd had Sarah followed by a private investigator for the past 2 months, before my death. Robert's illness had taught me to be suspicious about money, and something about Michael's behavior around our investments had troubled me. The PI had uncovered Michael's gambling addiction, his affairs with 2 different women, and Sarah's consultation with a divorce attorney about protecting her upcoming inheritance from marital assets. They'd planned to kill me, split the money, then divorce each other within a year. Even their marriage was just another financial transaction. Someone's watching us, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Someone knows everything. What if it's Mom's ghost? Ghosts don't make phone calls, Michael snapped. But I could hear the fear in his voice, too. They were both cracking under the pressure, making mistakes. Michael had started drinking heavily. While Sarah was taking anxiety medication she'd stolen from a friend. Their carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The insurance investigation was expanding, too. Detective Morrison had interviewed their neighbors, their co-workers, even the hiking guide service Michael had contacted, but ultimately decided not to use. Each conversation revealed more inconsistencies in their story. But my favorite development was watching their financial desperation grow. Without the insurance payout, They couldn't cover their bills. The mortgage payment was 3 weeks overdue. Credit card companies were calling constantly. The life they'd planned to fund with my death was evaporating. "We need to take out another loan," Sarah said during one of their late-night arguments I recorded. "Against what collateral? Your mother's house is tied up in probate until the insurance thing gets resolved. Then we sell something. The car, my jewelry, anything. We already sold everything valuable. Sarah, we're broke." It was music to my dead ears. But the real masterpiece came when I decided to visit them in person. Not as Margaret Thompson, she was still dead as far as they knew, as someone else entirely. I'd spent considerable money on a complete appearance transformation. Professional hair dye to auburn, colored contact lenses to change my eye color, makeup techniques to alter my facial structure. Combined with a 20-pound weight loss from stress and careful padding in the right places, I looked like a completely different woman. I knocked on their door Tuesday evening, introducing myself as Helen Morrison, Detective Morrison's partner from the Insurance Fraud Division. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but we have some new information about your mother's case that couldn't wait." Sarah's face went white, but she invited me in. Michael appeared moments later, clearly drunk. "What kind of information?" he asked, swaying slightly. "The kind that changes everything," I said, settling into the living room chair where I'd sat for countless family dinners. "We found something at the bottom of the cliff." The silence was electric. Sarah gripped Michael's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. "What did you find?" she whispered. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a small recording device. Actually just an old digital camera, but they couldn't tell the difference in the dim lighting. "Your mother's personal recorder. She was apparently in the habit of documenting her activities. Very thorough woman." Michael's face went gray. "That's impossible. Mom didn't use technology like that." But Sarah knew better. She remembered how meticulous I'd always been about keeping records, how I'd documented everything after Robert's cancer diagnosis. Her face told me she was imagining all the conversations that might be on that device. "The recording cuts off abruptly," I continued, "but we can hear voices in the background. Your voices, specifically, having a very interesting conversation about insurance policies and financial problems." "We want a lawyer," Michael said immediately. "That's certainly your right," I agreed, standing up. "But I thought you should know. The district attorney is planning to file charges tomorrow morning. Murder in the first degree, insurance fraud, conspiracy. The recording provides clear evidence of premeditation." Sarah started hyperventilating. Michael began pacing like a caged animal. "Unless," I added casually, "you'd like to cooperate with our investigation. Help us understand exactly what happened on that trail." "What kind of cooperation?" Sarah asked through her tears. "Full confession. Details about the planning, the execution, your financial motives. In exchange, we might be able to negotiate lesser charges." I left them with 24 hours to decide, knowing they'd spend every minute of it in hell. They called Detective Helen Morrison at 6 a.m. the next morning. Sarah's voice was hoarse from crying. Michael's was shaking from withdrawal sweats. "We want to make a deal," Sarah said. "Meet us at the police station at noon," I replied. "Bring your lawyer." Of course, I had no intention of meeting them at any police station. Instead, I spent the morning setting up the final phase of my plan. The real Detective Morrison was having an interesting morning too. I'd sent him copies of all my surveillance recordings, along with detailed financial records showing Sarah and Michael's debts, their insurance policy research, and their suspicious behavior patterns. I'd also included the fake confession I was about to extract from them. By the time Sarah and Michael arrived at the police station at noon, Detective Morrison was waiting with actual arrest warrants, but I wasn't done with them yet. While they were being processed downtown, I was back at my house, the house they'd planned to inherit, making some final preparations. I'd been living in motels for 2 weeks, but tonight I was coming home. The surveillance equipment stayed active. I wanted to record everything that was about to happen. They made bail that evening, using the last of their credit card cash advances. When they returned to their house, exhausted and traumatized, they found me sitting in their living room. Not Helen Morrison, not a detective. Me, Margaret Thompson, their supposedly dead mother, very much alive and absolutely furious. "Hello, darlings," I said as they walked through the door. "We need to talk." Sarah screamed and fainted. Michael tried to run, but I'd locked the doors from the inside. "Sit down, Michael," I said calmly. "Let's discuss your financial planning strategies." When Sarah regained consciousness, she stared at me like I was actually a ghost. "You're dead," she whispered. "We saw you fall. You're dead." "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated," I said, borrowing from Mark Twain. "Though your disappointment about that is duly noted." Michael had gone completely silent, his brain apparently unable to process the impossibility of my presence. "I have some good news and some bad news," I continued. "The good news is that you're not going to prison for murder, since your victim is obviously still breathing. The bad news is that attempted murder still carries a significant sentence." "Mom," Sarah started, but I held up my hand. "You lost the right to call me that when you pushed me off a cliff for my life insurance money. I prefer Margaret now." I'd prepared a detailed presentation of their crimes, complete with recorded confessions, financial evidence, and a timeline of their murder plot. Everything was documented, witnessed, and legally admissible. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "You're going to confess to attempted murder. You're going to plead guilty to insurance fraud. And you're going to spend the next several years in prison thinking about what you lost when you decided I was worth more dead than alive." "We can explain," Michael said desperately. "We were in debt. We were desperate. We never meant to actually hurt you." "You pushed me off a 200-foot cliff," I replied. "Exactly which part of that wasn't meant to hurt me?" Sarah was crying again, but these weren't the crocodile tears she'd shed at my memorial service. These were the tears of someone whose entire world was collapsing. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Mom. We made a terrible mistake." "No," I corrected her. "You made a calculated decision to commit murder for money, and now you're going to live with the consequences." But there was one more surprise waiting for them. "Before we conclude our family reunion," I said, pulling out a thick legal document, "there's something else you should know about your inheritance." Both Sarah and Michael looked at the papers with desperate hope. Even facing attempted murder charges, they were still thinking about money. "The will reading you missed while you were being arrested?" I continued. "It contained some interesting provisions. This was my masterstroke, planned during those long hours in the motel room while they thought I was dead. I'd had my attorney draw up a new will 3 days before the hiking trip, one that Sarah and Michael knew nothing about. I changed my will 2 weeks ago," I said. "Funny thing about Mother's intuition. Something told me I needed to be more careful about my estate planning." Sarah's face went white. "What kind of changes?" "The kind that reflect my growing concerns about your financial stability and decision-making capabilities." I opened the document and began reading the relevant sections. "In the event of my death under suspicious circumstances, or if my daughter Sarah Walsh or her husband Michael Walsh are charged with any crimes related to my death, all assets previously designated for their inheritance shall be transferred to the following charities." I listed them all: the children's hospital where I'd volunteered, the animal shelter where Robert had adopted our dog, the scholarship fund at my old nursing school. Organizations that would actually use the money to help people instead of funding luxury vacations and gambling debts. $5 million, I continued, going to people who deserve it instead of people who tried to murder me for it. Michael looked like he might have a heart attack. "You can't do that. We're your family." "Family doesn't push family members off cliffs," I replied. "Besides, this is all academic since I'm not actually dead. The money was never yours to begin with." But Sarah was staring at the document with growing horror. "The date," she whispered. "The date on this will... It's from before the hiking trip." "That's correct. I had some concerns about your lifestyle choices and wanted to ensure my money would be used responsibly." The truth was even more devastating than my lie. I'd been planning to revise my will anyway, not because I suspected they'd try to kill me, but because I'd grown tired of bankrolling their irresponsible spending. The hiking trip had just accelerated my timeline. "So even if you'd succeeded in murdering me," I said, "you wouldn't have inherited anything anyway. You would have committed murder for nothing." The silence that followed was deafening. All their planning, all their risk-taking, all their betrayal, and it was all for money they were never going to receive. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Now you go to prison," I said simply. "The district attorney has enough evidence to convict you both. The recordings, the financial records, your behavior patterns, it's all very compelling. And then Then you live with the knowledge that you destroyed your family for money you were never going to get, that you traded your mother's love for a pipe dream, that you are exactly the kind of people who deserve to lose everything. I stood up, gathering my papers. Oh, and one more thing. I'm donating your house to charity too. Turns out I co-signed for your mortgage, which makes me a co-owner. Since you'll be unable to make the payments from prison, I'll be assuming full ownership and gifting it to the homeless shelter downtown. Michael lunged toward me, but I was ready. The pepper spray I'd been carrying since my resurrection stopped him cold. Violence seems to run in the family, I observed as he writhed on the floor. Good thing I've learned to defend myself. I walked toward the door, then turned back for one final comment. For what it's worth, I really did love you both. But love has its limits, and attempted murder is definitely beyond them. I left them there, crying, defeated, and finally understanding the true cost of their greed. But I wasn't quite finished with them yet. The trial was a media sensation. Mother returns from dead to testify against daughter's murder plot made headlines across the country. I gave exactly one interview to a local reporter who'd covered Robert's obituary with unusual kindness. "How does it feel to be betrayed by your own child?" she asked. "It feels like clarity," I replied. "For the first time in years, I see people exactly as they are instead of as I hoped they might be." Sarah and Michael's defense attorney tried to argue temporary insanity, financial desperation, even claimed I'd driven them to it through emotional manipulation. None of it worked. The recordings were too clear, the evidence too overwhelming. But the real revelation came during Sarah's testimony. "Why did you decide to kill your mother?" the prosecutor asked. Sarah's answer shocked everyone in the courtroom, including me. "Because she was going to cut us off anyway," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "She'd been asking too many questions about our finances, making comments about our spending. I knew she was planning to change her will." The prosecutor pressed further. "So this wasn't just about inheriting her money?" "No, it was about getting it before she could give it away. Mom was always threatening to donate everything to charity if we didn't shape up. We couldn't risk waiting." I sat in the witness gallery, stunned. They hadn't killed me for my money. They'd killed me to prevent me from giving it away. The very act of trying to teach them financial responsibility had convinced them that murder was their only option. "Did you consider simply improving your financial management instead?" the prosecutor asked. Sarah laughed bitterly. "Have you seen the bills we had? The debt? We were drowning. Mom's money was the only way out. And you never considered asking her for help directly? She would have said no. She was always lecturing us about living within our means, about taking responsibility. She never understood that some of us don't have the luxury of perfect financial planning. The luxury. She'd characterized my lifetime of careful saving and responsible spending as a luxury, as if it was something I'd been born with rather than something I'd earned through decades of sacrifice. But the most devastating moment came when Michael took the stand. "I never wanted to hurt Margaret," he said, tears streaming down his face. "But Sarah convinced me it was the only way. She said her mother would never miss the money, that she was too old to enjoy it anyway." "Too old to enjoy life?" the prosecutor pressed. Sarah said Margaret had already lived her life, had her marriage, raised her family, traveled with her husband. Sarah said it was our turn now, that we deserved a chance to live well while we were still young enough to appreciate it. I felt something break inside me at those words. My daughter had convinced her husband that I was finished living, that my remaining years were worthless compared to their desire for immediate gratification. But Michael wasn't done. The worst part is, Sarah was already planning to divorce me once she got the inheritance. I found the papers in her purse while we were waiting for the insurance investigator. I was going to help her commit murder, and she was going to take all the money and leave me anyway. The courtroom erupted. Sarah screamed at Michael, calling him a liar. Michael screamed back, accusing her of manipulating him from the beginning. Their defense collapsed into mutual accusations and finger-pointing. I watched my daughter and her husband destroy each other with the same viciousness they'd tried to use on me, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Sarah received 15 years for attempted murder and conspiracy. Michael got 12 years for his cooperation and slightly lesser role in the planning. Both received additional sentences for insurance fraud and identity theft. As they were led away in handcuffs, Sarah turned to look at me one last time. "I hope you're satisfied," she said. "I am," I replied. Finally. But there was still one more chapter to this story. 6 months after the trial, I did something I'd never done in my entire life. I threw myself a party. Not a birthday party or anniversary celebration, but a still alive and loving it party. I invited everyone who'd supported me through the trial, Detective Morrison, my attorney, the neighbors who'd testified on my behalf, even the Texas couple who'd helped me after my fall. We gathered in the backyard of my house, the same house Sarah and Michael had planned to inherit. I'd had it professionally redecorated, removing every trace of their presence. It finally felt like home again. "You know what the funny thing is?" I told my assembled guests during my impromptu speech. "Being pushed off that cliff was the best thing that ever happened to me." They laughed, thinking I was joking, but I was completely serious. For 65 years, I defined myself by how much other people needed me. I was Robert's wife, Sarah's mother, everyone's helper and supporter. I measured my worth by how useful I was to my family. I raised my glass of champagne, the good stuff that Sarah had always admired but never been offered. But dead people don't have to be useful. Dead people don't have to be accommodating or grateful or endlessly forgiving. Dead people can be absolutely ruthless in pursuit of justice. Detective Morrison stood up. "To Margaret Thompson," he said, "the most dangerous dead woman I've ever met." "To Margaret Thompson," everyone echoed. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home, I sat on my back deck watching the sunset and thinking about the strange journey that had brought me here. I'd received dozens of letters from other elderly people who'd seen the news coverage, stories of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, family members who saw inheritance as an entitlement rather than a gift. My case had apparently inspired others to seek help, to set boundaries, to refuse to be victims. I'd also been contacted by 3 different publishers wanting to buy the rights to my story. Movie producers, documentary filmmakers, even a Broadway composer interested in turning my resurrection into a musical. But the most meaningful contact came from an organization that helped elderly abuse victims. They wanted me to become a spokesperson, to share my story as a way of encouraging others to fight back against family exploitation. "You've shown that being old doesn't mean being powerless," the director told me. "Your story gives people hope." Hope. Not something I'd expected to be dispensing at 65, but I liked the idea. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed the state prison number. "Margaret Thompson?" the automated voice said. "You have a collect call from Sarah Walsh. Will you accept the charges?" I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "No," I said, and hung up. Some bridges once burned should never be rebuilt. Some relationships once poisoned by murder attempts can't be salvaged with apologies and explanations. I had a new life now, built on the ashes of the old one. A life where I was valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. Where my money was mine to spend or donate as I saw fit. Where family was defined by love and respect rather than blood and obligation. Sarah and Michael had tried to kill me for $5 million they were never going to receive anyway. Instead, they'd given me something far more valuable. The knowledge that I was strong enough to survive anything, smart enough to outwit anyone who underestimated me, and ruthless enough to destroy people who threatened me. They'd thought they were pushing a helpless old woman off a cliff. Instead, they'd awakened a force of nature they never saw coming. And that force of nature was just getting started. I poured myself another glass of champagne and smiled at the setting sun. Tomorrow, I was meeting with the Abuse Prevention Organization. Next week, I was flying to New York to discuss the book deal. Next month, I was starting a foundation to help elderly victims of family financial abuse. My daughter had tried to end my story by pushing me off a cliff. Instead, she'd just given me the perfect opening chapter for the rest of my life. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.